The sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked, barren earth as Simon Miller wiped the sweat from his brow. He was a man built by hard work, calloused hands, weathered skin, and a heart that had seen more toil than joy. He had spent years building a life for his wife, Karen, and their teenage son Max, hoping that one day they'd have enough. But enough never came. The Millers had struggled for years. Simon worked double shifts at the local factory, sometimes taking on side jobs to keep food on the table. Max was a good kid, quiet and focused, doing well in school and dreaming of a better life. For Simon, those dreams were enough to keep him going, even when the burden felt unbearable. What Simon didn't know was that the weight of their poverty was pressing down even harder on Karen, suffocating her in ways he couldn't imagine. Karen had always been beautiful. Her blonde hair and sharp blue eyes captivating enough to turn heads even as she passed 40. But beauty couldn't pay the bills. The bills that piled up were a constant reminder of the life she never had, a life of luxury and ease that felt impossibly far away. That's when he appeared. Robert Sterling, an older millionaire who had made his fortune in real estate and stocks, rolled into their lives like a storm. He had it all. Charm, charisma, and most importantly, wealth beyond Karen's wildest dreams. The moment she met him, Karen knew he was her way out of the poverty-stricken life she despised. It started innocently enough. Robert, who owned the building where Karen worked part-time as a cleaner, was friendly and flirtatious. He paid her compliments, offered her small gifts, and always seemed to have an air of generosity that Karen found irresistible. It wasn't long before she fell into his arms, and eventually into his bed. She told herself it was just an escape, a little reprieve from her difficult life. But as weeks turned into months, Karen's affair with Robert became more than a fling. He promised her a life of luxury, a mansion in the hills, expensive cars and designer clothes. Karen became obsessed with this new reality, and soon the guilt of betraying her husband faded into the background. She convinced herself she deserved more than the meager existence Simon could provide. One evening, after a long shift at the factory, Simon came home to an empty house. The TV was still on, but there was no sign of Karen. Max sat quietly at the dinner table, poking at a cold plate of food. "Where's your mother?" Simon asked, his voice gruff with exhaustion. Max shrugged, not looking up. "She said she had errands left a couple of hours ago." Simon sighed and sank into his chair. This wasn't the first time Karen had disappeared without explanation. Lately, it had been happening more often, and Simon couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that something was wrong. He chalked it up to stress. Perhaps Karen was just overwhelmed by their situation, but deep down, he couldn't shake the unease creeping into his bones. The weeks went by, and Karen's absences became longer, her excuses thinner. One day she didn't come home at all. Simon stayed up all night waiting for her, but when the sun rose the next morning, Karen still wasn't there. It wasn't until later that day that Simon found the note. It was short, cruelly so. Karen had written that she was leaving. She had found someone who could give her the life she deserved, and she couldn't live in poverty any longer. There was no apology, no remorse, just a cold, blunt declaration that she was abandoning her family for a wealthier man. Simon stood there, staring at the note in disbelief, his heart shattering into 1,000 pieces. The woman he had loved and worked so hard for had turned her back on him and their son for money. He couldn't understand how she could be so heartless. Max, who had found the note first, had said nothing. He sat on the couch, staring into space, his fists clenched in silent rage. The betrayal cut him deeper than it did Simon. Simon's heart thudded in his chest. His pulse loud in his ears as he read and reread the note. His hands trembled slightly, the paper crinkling between his fingers. The woman he had loved for almost 2 decades, the mother of his child, had chosen wealth and comfort over the life they had built over him, over Max. He sank into a chair at the kitchen table, the weight of exhaustion, betrayal, and confusion pressing down on him all at once. His mind tried to piece together how this had happened, what signs he had missed. But every memory of Karen from the last few months flashed before him like fragments of a shattered mirror. Her absences, the cold way she had started to treat him, the nights when she would come home late, her excuses paper thin. Max stood in the doorway of the small living room, his expression unreadable. His teenage face, normally calm and quiet, now had a rigid intensity to it. A quiet storm brewing in his eyes. For Max, the betrayal was personal. His mother had been his anchor in a world that constantly reminded him how little they had. She was supposed to be the one who comforted him when he was frustrated about not having new clothes, the one who told him that they would find a way, no matter how tough things were. Now she was just gone, without warning or care. "I knew something was wrong," Max said, finally, his voice hollow, staring at the worn floorboards. "I could feel it. She didn't care about us anymore." Simon looked up at his son, the words weighing heavily in the room. "Max, I didn't see this coming." Max's fist clenched and unclenched. "She's with him, isn't she? The rich guy, the one who owns that big house on the other side of town." Simon felt a stab of guilt. The pieces were starting to come together for him now, too. He had heard about Robert Sterling, the wealthy businessman who everyone in their small town knew about. Simon had heard his name whispered at the factory, had seen glimpses of Karen's interactions with Robert when he would occasionally show up at her workplace, smiling that rich, carefree smile. But Simon had brushed it off, trusting Karen, trusting their love. Now he felt foolish. She hadn't just been slipping away. She'd been running to a life where she didn't have to struggle, to a life of fine dining, luxury cars, and gilded living. Max's voice hardened as he stepped closer. "She left us, Dad, for money, for some old guy with a mansion. What are we supposed to do now?" Simon couldn't answer. His throat tightened and a deep, unrelenting sorrow settled into his bones. He tried to gather the strength to comfort Max, but it was Max who had to be strong. Simon had never felt this helpless in his life. His job was to protect his family, but how could he protect them from this? Over the next few days, life at home became a hollow shell of what it used to be. Karen was gone and her absence was everywhere, her side of the bed cold, her chair at the table empty, her laughter a distant memory. Simon barely managed to function. Forcing himself to get up and go to work, his body acting on autopilot while his mind churned with endless questions. At night, he stared at the ceiling, wondering where Karen was. Was she enjoying the luxury Robert Sterling promised her? Did she even think of them? Max, on the other hand, wasn't as silent as before. His anger grew, simmering beneath the surface, manifesting in small ways. A slammed door, an angry outburst. Long walks where he would disappear for hours. He hated how Simon seemed paralyzed, how his father wasn't fighting back. To Max, the pain was a fire inside him, burning hotter every day. It wasn't until Simon started getting sick that Max's anger began to bubble over. The stress of Karen's departure had taken a toll on Simon's body. He had been skipping meals, barely sleeping, and working overtime to keep their bills paid. Soon, his health deteriorated. He would wake up with fevers, hacking coughs that racked his body, his face pale and drawn. He tried to push through it, but his body was breaking down. Within weeks, Simon was bedridden, unable to work. Doctors said it was pneumonia, but Max knew it was more than that. It was heartbreak. It was betrayal. It was Karen's absence eating him alive. Max watched as his father wasted away and the rage inside him grew. Karen had done this. She had left them to rot while she lived a life of luxury with her millionaire lover, Robert Sterling. Max said the name with venom in his mind, each syllable feeding the hatred that gnawed at him. Max wasn't just angry anymore. He wanted revenge. He started by tracking them down. It wasn't hard. Robert Sterling's mansion was the most opulent estate in the area, set back from the town with tall iron gates and manicured lawns. Max made several trips there, each time lurking in the shadows, watching. He saw Karen with him, saw her draped in expensive clothes, smiling in a way that made his stomach churn. She looked like she didn't have a care in the world, like she had completely forgotten about the family she had left behind. The final straw came one afternoon when Max saw Karen laughing with Robert near the pool, champagne in hand. It was the kind of laugh that Max hadn't heard in years. A carefree sound that seemed to mock everything he and his father had been through. She had moved on, and worse. She had abandoned them for a life that would never include them again. That night, Max came home to his father's shallow breathing, the sound of Simon's weakened body fighting to keep going. Max couldn't take it anymore. He made a decision. Max spent days planning, carefully thinking through every detail. He watched Robert's estate, learning the routines of the staff, the security measures, and when Karen and Robert would be alone, his mind became singularly focused. There was no room for doubt. He would make them pay for what they had done. On a cold, moonless night, Max snuck out of the house, his heart pounding in his chest, but his resolve ironclad. He wore dark clothes, a hood pulled low over his face, and carried a small duffel bag filled with tools he had gathered. His plan was simple but brutal. He would break into the mansion, and he would make sure neither Robert nor Karen ever hurt his father or anyone else again. When Max reached the estate, he slipped through the back gate, his movements swift and silent. He had scoped out the mansion for weeks, and he knew exactly where to enter through a side door near the kitchen that was often left unlocked. As he crept through the massive house, his pulse quickened, but he didn't falter. He found them in the living room, Robert and Karen lounging on plush sofas, a fire crackling in the background. They were laughing softly, sharing a bottle of expensive wine. The sight of them together, so comfortable and content, sent a fresh wave of anger surging through Max. Without hesitation, he approached them from behind. In one swift motion, Max pulled a large kitchen knife from his bag and plunged it into Robert's chest. The man's eyes widened in shock, his body stiffening before he collapsed forward, blood gushing from the wound. Karen screamed, her voice piercing the stillness of the night. Max turned to her, his face contorted with rage. "How could you?" he spat, his voice trembling with fury. "You left us. You left Dad to die." Karen's eyes were wide with terror as she backed away, her hands trembling. "Max, please. I didn't mean for this to happen. I just wanted a better life." "A better life," Max snarled, stepping closer. "You abandoned us for this? For money?" Karen sobbed, her back hitting the wall as she ran out of space. "I'm sorry, Max. Please don't do this." But Max was beyond reasoning. The knife in his hand was still dripping with Robert's blood as he moved toward his mother. "You don't get to walk away from this. You destroyed us. And now you're going to pay." In one final brutal motion, Max drove the knife into her abdomen, twisting the blade as Karen gasped, her eyes wide with shock and pain. She crumpled to the floor beside Robert, her life slipping away as she reached for her son. But Max stepped back, watching the light leave her eyes without a trace of remorse. The room was silent, save for the crackling of the fire and the sound of Max's ragged breathing. He stood there for a long time, staring down at the two bodies that had once been so full of life. The weight of what he had done settled over him like a heavy shroud. But he didn't regret it. Not yet. Max wiped the knife on his sleeve, his mind already racing with what he needed to do next. He had to clean up. He had to get rid of the evidence. He had planned for this moment. But now that it was real, it felt surreal. The night was far from over, and so was the revenge. Max disposed of the bodies, burning them in the estate's incinerator, erasing any trace of what had happened that night. The mansion was quiet again, as though the violence had never taken place. Max walked away from the estate with a grim sense of satisfaction. The weight of his mother's betrayal and Robert's presence hung heavily in the air, but he felt a strange relief wash over him. He had taken control of a situation that had spiraled out of his hands for too long. The lives of the two who had abandoned him and his father had ended, and while the enormity of his actions loomed over him, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had finally done something decisive. As he walked back home, the cold air whipped around him, mixing with the adrenaline that surged through his veins. He thought about his father and how the man had fought tooth and nail to keep their family afloat, and how he had endured so much suffering at the hands of someone who was supposed to love him. It was all for nothing now. He wouldn't let Karen's selfishness destroy them any longer. When Max entered the house, he found it dark and quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos he had just left behind. The familiar smell of old wood and the faint scent of dust filled the air. He moved silently to his father's room, where he found Simon asleep, his face pale and drawn, a stark reminder of the toll that Karen's betrayal had taken on him. Max sat on the edge of the bed, watching his father breathe. He felt a pang of guilt for what he had done, but reminded himself of the pain they had both endured. "I did this for you, Dad," he whispered, as if Simon could hear him, as if the confession could absolve him of the weight of his actions. He had to act fast. He couldn't let Simon find out about the murders. His father needed to heal, and the truth would only hurt him further. The police would soon be searching for Robert and Karen, and if they didn't find them, the news of their disappearance would raise questions. Max had to prepare himself for what was to come. The next day, as dawn broke and bathed the house in soft light, Max donned his mask of normalcy. He busied himself with breakfast, making sure to keep the noise to a minimum as he moved through the motions. He cracked eggs into the skillet, the sizzle sound filling the silence. But his mind was racing with thoughts of the previous night. When Simon awoke, the warmth of the sun seemed to do little to alleviate his pallor. He shuffled into the kitchen, still groggy. "Morning, Max," he murmured, his voice hoarse. "Hey, Dad, how are you feeling?" Max asked, forcing a smile, trying to hide the tumult of emotions inside. "Not great. I'm trying to get some strength back," Simon replied, his eyes weary and sunken. Tired. "Did you get your mother's call?" Max's heart raced. "No, I haven't heard from her. Maybe she's just busy. You know she's living a different life now." Simon nodded, but a shadow crossed his face. I hope she's okay. I can't help but worry." Max swallowed hard. "She's fine, Dad. She's got her life now. We need to focus on us." The conversation left a bitter taste in Max's mouth. He had lied to his father, but he also felt he was protecting him. The rest of the day passed in a haze, the mundane tasks of cleaning and cooking filling the void of his mother's absence. Simon rested, trying to regain his strength while Max kept his secrets locked away. Days turned into weeks, and as Max took on more responsibilities around the house, he felt a strange sense of calm. He had taken control of their situation. But he also sensed an unease growing within him. The fear of being discovered loomed over his head like a dark cloud. Each time he saw a police car drive by or heard sirens in the distance, his heart raced. He feared the truth would come crashing down around him. However, the town was abuzz with gossip about Robert and Karen's disappearance. Whispers filled the air about how a couple so prominent could just vanish without a trace. Max would hear snippets of conversation at school, and it made his skin crawl. He had become a master of maintaining his facade, laughing at the right moments, nodding when necessary, all the while feeling like a fraud. One evening, as Max was cleaning up the dinner table, the doorbell rang, cutting through the silence. He exchanged a worried glance with Simon before making his way to the door. When he opened it, he was met with the stern faces of two police officers. "Good evening, son. Is your father home?" one of them asked, his voice grave. Max's stomach dropped. "Yes, just a second," he stammered, stepping back to allow them entry. Simon appeared from the kitchen, a towel draped over his shoulder. "Can I help you, officers?" "Mr. Miller, we need to ask you a few questions regarding your wife, Karen Miller, and Robert Sterling," the officer said, his tone businesslike. Max's heart raced as he fought to keep his expression neutral. "What about them?" "They've been reported missing. We have some questions about their last known whereabouts," the officer continued, watching Simon closely. "Missing," Simon echoed, confusion evident in his eyes. But Karen wouldn't just leave. She wouldn't abandon us." Max's throat tightened. He wanted to shout that she had abandoned them willingly, but he kept his mouth shut. The officers exchanged glances, sensing the tension in the air. "Do you know where she might be, Mr. Miller?" the officer pressed. Simon shook his head. "No, she hasn't been home in weeks. I just assumed she was off living her life, happy without us." Max felt the weight of his father's words. Happy without us. That's exactly what Karen had chosen. "Do you mind if we look around the property?" the other officer asked, glancing around. "Sure, of course," Simon replied, his demeanor shifting to one of concern. As the officers moved through the house, Max felt his heart race. He couldn't let them discover anything that would point back to him. He fought to maintain his composure while they rifled through their belongings, their questions growing more pointed. Did you notice anything unusual before she disappeared? One officer asked, scanning the room. No, Simon replied, his brow furrowed in thought. She had been acting a bit strange, but I just thought she was stressed about money. I had no idea she'd leave us. Max bit his lip, holding back the flood of emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. He could see the worry etching itself deeper into his father's face, the lines of age deepening further. Thank you for your time, Mr. Miller, the first officer said, his voice stern but polite. If you remember anything else, please don't hesitate to call us. As the officers left, the air felt charged, heavy with unspoken thoughts. Max sank back into a chair, his heart racing. They had come too close to discovering the truth, and it scared him to death. Max, Simon said, his voice low and troubled. What if something happened to her? What if she's in trouble? Max forced himself to meet his father's gaze. Dad, we can't worry about her. She made her choice. We have to focus on us. As days turned into weeks, Max continued to feel the pressure building. He found himself growing paranoid, constantly glancing over his shoulder, convinced that the police were watching him. They were closing in, and he had to do something to divert their attention. Then, a week later, Max got a call from an unknown number. He hesitated before answering, anxiety gnawing at his insides. Max, it's Rachel, a voice said. Rachel was one of his closest friends, and he could hear urgency in her tone. Hey, what's up? I heard about your mom and Robert, she said, her voice low. People are saying they might have run off together, but it's not just rumors. The cops are investigating, and I heard they found some evidence at the estate. Max's heart sank. What kind of evidence? They didn't say, but people are saying it's linked to a crime scene or something. They're saying it's serious. You need to be careful. Max's mind raced. Had he left behind something incriminating? Had they found the bodies? What do you mean? He asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Just don't let anyone see you acting weird, okay? People are talking. They're looking for answers. I will, Max replied. But inside, he felt like the walls were closing in on him. The fear of discovery was becoming unbearable. And he had to do something to put a stop to it. The next day, he devised a plan. He would create an alibi for himself. He would throw suspicion off of him. It wouldn't be easy, but Max was determined. He began to act like the grieving son, attending public gatherings and making a show of his sorrow. He went to the local diner and spoke with friends, feigning concern for his mother. I just hope she's okay, he would say, his voice choked with emotion. I can't believe she'd leave us like this. As he mingled, he caught snippets of conversations about Karen and Robert. Most were mere gossip, but some had substance. People speculated about whether they had run off together or if something more sinister had occurred. Max drank in the rumors, using them to fuel his own narrative. Meanwhile, he kept the secret locked away, convinced he could continue this charade indefinitely. However, as days turned into weeks, he felt the cracks in his facade begin to show. The weight of his actions pressed down on him more heavily with each passing moment. And then it happened. Late one night, as Max lay in bed, a loud knock startled him awake. It echoed through the house, the sound sharp and jarring. His heart raced as he crept toward the door, dread pooling in his stomach. Who is it? He called out, his voice barely above a whisper. Max, open up. It's Rachel. With trembling hands, he opened the door. Rachel stood there, her face pale and eyes wide with fear. You need to come with me. They're searching for you. What? Why? Max asked, panic rising in his throat. I overheard the cops talking about you, Max. They think you might know something about your mom and Robert's disappearance. They're looking for you, and they have evidence that connects you to the mansion. The world tilted beneath him. Evidence. What kind of evidence? I don't know, but you have to go now. Max's mind raced. His first instinct was to flee, to run away and hide. But where could he go? Where could he possibly escape from the truth? I can't just leave my dad. Take him with you, Rachel urged. We'll figure this out. Just trust me. In that moment, Max made a choice. He gathered a few belongings, taking only what he needed, and woke Simon. Dad, we have to go now. What's happening? Simon mumbled, still disoriented. They're looking for us, Dad. We can't stay here. Simon's eyes widened with fear. Why? What did you do? Max shook his head, panic clawing at his throat. It doesn't matter. Just trust me. We have to leave. Together, they snuck out the back door, moving quietly through the shadows. Max felt the weight of their reality pressing down on him. But he knew they had no choice. The police were closing in, and if they stayed, the truth would unravel, leaving nothing but destruction in its wake. They slipped into Rachel's car, and as she drove away from their home, Max stared out the window, the familiar streets of his childhood fading into the distance. He felt a mix of emotions, fear, guilt, and an unsettling sense of freedom as they sped away. Simon's voice broke the silence. Max, what's going on? What did you do? Max turned to his father, the weight of his actions crashing down on him. I didn't mean for it to happen. I just couldn't let her hurt us anymore. I thought it would be better this way. Simon's expression was a mixture of disbelief and hurt. Better. How? You think running away will fix this? Max clenched his jaw, anger flaring. She left us. She chose someone else. I did what I had to do. Simon's eyes filled with a mix of sadness and confusion. Son, we can't just run from this. You need to face what you've done. I can't, Dad, Max shouted, the walls of the car feeling like they were closing in. If they find out, it's over for both of us. Rachel glanced at Max through the rear-view mirror, her expression serious. We need to find a place to lay low until we can figure this out. I know a guy who can help us. Max nodded, trying to quell the panic rising within him. He was losing control of everything, but he wouldn't let it spiral further. They drove deeper into the night, the weight of his choices pressing heavily on his heart. They arrived at a rundown motel on the outskirts of town, a far cry from the lives they once led. Max felt a pang of sadness as they entered the dingy room, the stark reality of their situations settling over him. This was no longer just about his mother's betrayal. It was about survival. Now, as they settled in, Max struggled with the enormity of what he had done. The adrenaline that had fueled him in the beginning began to fade, replaced by a haunting sense of dread. He had taken 2 lives, and no amount of rationalization could change that. Max, Simon said, his voice trembling. We need to talk about what happened. We can't just pretend it didn't happen. Max looked away, the weight of his father's words pressing down on him. I thought I was protecting us. No, you thought you could just fix everything with violence. Simon's voice rose, the pain of betrayal evident. You've put us both in danger. I didn't want to lose you, Max shouted back, his emotions boiling over. She was destroying our lives. I couldn't just sit back and let it happen. Silence filled the room as they both wrestled with their emotions. Max felt the walls closing in again, and the panic threatened to consume him. He had wanted to protect his father, but he was dragging them both into a deeper abyss. Days passed in a haze, the motel room becoming a prison of their own making. They took turns keeping watch, afraid that the police would find them. Max struggled to eat and sleep, guilt gnawing at him like a relentless predator. He couldn't shake the feeling that every choice he made was leading them closer to disaster. Rachel, however, remained a beacon of determination. We need to come up with a plan. We can't stay here forever, she urged, pacing the room. I know a way to clear your name, Max. We just have to find the right evidence to prove what really happened. Max looked at her, hope flickering in his chest. What do you mean? If we can find something that links Robert to something illegal, it could shift the focus off you, Rachel explained. I've heard rumors about him. He had dealings with some shady people, and if we can expose that, it might work in your favor. Max felt a glimmer of possibility. But how do we find that? It's not like we can just walk back into town. Leave that to me, Rachel replied confidently. I have some contacts. Just stay low and I'll get us the information we need. Max nodded, a plan forming in his mind. If they could prove Robert was involved in something illegal, it would give them leverage. They could use that to sway the police to pull the focus away from Max. It was a long shot, but it was a chance. With Rachel's help, they worked in secret, piecing together what they could about Robert's business dealings. As they searched through public records and online databases, Max felt a sense of purpose reigniting within him. Maybe there was a way out of this. However, their investigation took a dark turn when they discovered something shocking. Robert had not only been involved in shady business, but had connections to an underground crime syndicate. As they dug deeper, they found evidence of money laundering, drugs, and threats of violence, information that could destroy many lives if it ever got out. "This could be it," Rachel said, excitement lacing her voice. "If we can get this to the right people, we can expose him and clear your name." Max nodded, adrenaline coursing through him again. "We have to be careful. If they find out, we're on to them." Before he could finish, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed outside their motel door. Max's heart raced. "What is that?" Rachel's eyes widened as they all froze, listening intently. The footsteps stopped abruptly, followed by a loud banging on the door. "Police, open up." Max's breath caught in his throat. "Oh God, what do we do?" "Hide," Rachel hissed, her eyes darting around the room. Max pushed Simon into the bathroom, grabbing Rachel and pulling her down with him as they crouched behind the bed. He felt a surge of panic as the door slammed open and the officers flooded in, their flashlights illuminating the room. "Where is he?" one officer barked. "We know he's in here." Max held his breath, the pounding of his heart echoing in his ears as they searched the room. They had come too close, and if they found them, it would all be over. "Clear," one officer shouted. "Let's check the bathroom." The tension in the air was suffocating as Max watched through a small gap between the bed and the wall. He could see the officer reaching for the bathroom door, and time seemed to stretch as dread filled his chest. But then, as if the universe had intervened, a loud crash came from outside. A nearby car had backfired, sending the officers rushing out of the room to see what had happened. "Go, go," Rachel whispered urgently, motioning for Max and Simon to follow her. They didn't need to be told twice. They slipped out of the room and into the night, adrenaline surging through them as they fled the motel. The three of them dashed down the alley behind the motel, hearts racing as they ran for their lives. They didn't know where they were going, but they couldn't stay in one place any longer. Eventually, they found refuge in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. The place was dark and filled with remnants of a life long forgotten, but it offered a sense of security. They huddled together, catching their breath. "We can't stay here for long," Rachel said, her voice shaky. "They're going to be looking for us." Max nodded, the weight of their situation pressing down on him. "We need to find a way to get that evidence out." "But how?" As they began to discuss their options, Max's mind was racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. If they didn't act quickly, the truth would catch up with them, and he would lose everything he had tried to protect. Suddenly, a plan formed in his mind. What if we use the evidence against Robert and his connections? We could send it to a news outlet anonymously. They would have to investigate, and it would take the heat off me. Rachel's eyes widened with realization. That could work, but it's risky. If they find out we're behind it, we'll be long gone by then, Max insisted. We have to take that chance. They began to formulate their plan, working together to compile the evidence and get it ready to send out. Max felt a flicker of hope ignite within him. Maybe this was their chance to turn the tide. As they prepared to execute their plan, Max couldn't shake the sense of impending doom. The pressure was mounting, and he knew that if they failed, there would be no way out, but for the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of control. He was no longer a victim of circumstance. He was taking action. As night fell, they gathered around a makeshift table in the warehouse, laptops open and documents spread before them. They meticulously put together the evidence they had gathered, and Max felt a sense of urgency as he worked alongside Rachel. "We need to make sure everything is anonymous," Rachel reminded him, her fingers flying across the keyboard. If they trace it back to us, I know, Max said, his voice tense. Just be careful. Hours passed, the weight of their decisions hanging over them as they finished compiling everything. They set up a secure email, making sure to encrypt the files before sending them to a well-known journalist who had a reputation for uncovering corruption. All right, it's done, Rachel said, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and exhilaration. Now we just wait. Max nodded, the gravity of their actions crashing down on him, and hope it works. As they sat in the dim light of the warehouse, an uneasy silence enveloped them. Max felt the weight of his choices bearing down on him, but there was also a sense of relief. They had taken action, and now they had to see it through, but as the hours dragged on, the reality of their situation crept back in. They were still fugitives, running from the consequences of Max's actions. The police would not stop until they found him, and the evidence they had sent out could easily be dismissed or buried. Just when the anxiety began to feel overwhelming, Rachel's phone buzzed, breaking the silence. She looked at it, her expression shifting from confusion to alarm. Oh no, it's the cops. They're at the motel. Max's heart raced. What? How do you know? They're posting on social media, saying they're looking for us, Rachel replied, her voice shaking. They're even saying they think you're involved in a murder investigation. Max's stomach dropped. We need to go now. Where? Simon asked, fear evident in his voice. We can't stay here. We need to find somewhere safe, Rachel said, her mind racing. As they gathered their things, the weight of their choices settled heavily on Max's shoulders. He had plunged them into a situation he never thought he would find himself in, and the consequences were only beginning to unravel. Max, Simon said, his voice quiet but firm. We need to talk about this. We can't keep running. Later, Dad, Max snapped, frustration boiling over. We need to focus on getting out of here. Simon's expression hardened. No, we need to face this together. We can't keep running away from the truth. Max clenched his jaw, torn between anger and fear. I can't let them find out. You don't understand what I did. Then explain it to me, Simon demanded, his voice rising. What happened, Max? You have to tell me. Max's breath hitched as the weight of his actions crashed down on him. I didn't want to lose you. I thought I was protecting us. Tears filled Simon's eyes as he took a step closer. Son, running isn't the answer. You have to own up to what you did. Max felt the anger drain from him, leaving only despair. I can't face it, Dad. I can't. The moment hung in the air, the gravity of their situation closing in on them. Max was at a crossroads and he could feel the pressure building, but at that moment, a loud bang shattered the silence. The sound echoed through the warehouse, jolting them back to reality. Go now, Rachel shouted, her voice urgent. Max grabbed Simon's arm and they rushed toward the back exit just as the door burst open, police officers flooding in. The three of them sprinted out into the night, adrenaline pumping through their veins. They ran through the shadows, the sounds of pursuit echoing behind them. Max felt a surge of desperation as they ducked behind abandoned cars and raced down the alleyways, fear driving them forward. As they turned a corner, Max spotted a set of stairs leading up to an old, decrepit building. There, we can hide in there. They dashed up the stairs and slipped inside, the darkness swallowing them whole. As they caught their breath, Max leaned against the wall, panic swirling inside him. We can't keep running forever, Simon whispered. Fear etched on his face. Max knew he was right. They had to confront the truth to find a way out of this mess. I just wanted to protect you, Dad. I didn't want to lose you like I lost her. Simon placed a hand on Max's shoulder, his expression softening. Son, we'll figure this out together, but you have to be honest with me. You can't keep running from what you did. Max nodded, the gravity of his father's words settling in. They had to face the truth, no matter how painful it might be. He had made mistakes. But running away wasn't the answer. As they huddled together in the darkness, Max felt a flicker of determination ignite within him. They would face whatever came next together. He had taken a life, but he would not lose his own in the process. Thanks for watching. Subscribe and like this video for more true crime video. Don't forget to leave your thoughts and theories in the comments section below. Take care and see you in the next video.